Akela Lacy, politics reporter at The Intercept, who has been writing for really years on the sabotage and now impeachment efforts against Philadelphia DA Larry Krasner. Akela, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Emma. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. So, yesterday, Republicans in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives filed articles of impeachment against Larry Krasner. This is apparently their new favorite tactic. I think, what was it? They tried to impeach the governor because of just COVID generally, right? Or they spoke about it at least. They that seems to be something they're returning to. But here they've officially filed impeachment articles.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. They've been, threatening this for weeks at this point. People were going back and forth on whether or not a vote would actually happen because, as of today, the state house is adjourned until after Election Day. So, the fact that the impeachment efforts were being led by the person in the state Republican caucus who chairs their House campaign arm, among some of the other narratives around this, made it clear that this was part of their tactic ahead of Election Day. So that's some of the backdrop here. But yeah, they introduced the articles yesterday, along with a slew of other bills that have been introduced this week that would limit the prosecutorial authority of the district attorney's office in varying ways. So, like appointing a special prosecutor who wouldn't be elected and who would be able to, in theory, prosecute some of the crimes that Krasner's opponents say that he's not addressing. So they're kind of throwing a lot of things. They were throwing a lot of things at the wall to see what stuck.
None of this is impeachable. I mean, just to say this plainly, right? Just because you have a policy difference between the Philadelphia DA and what you would want as Republican tough on crimers, like, what is the underpinning, if any, that of these claims?
So there's not. This is one thing that sort of encapsulates the point that you're making is the report that the House Select Committee on Law and Order, their second interim report they released on Monday, which people were expecting them to recommend impeachment, based on, what it was unclear. But the report actually didn't make any recommendations. It said that the investigation of Krasner's office would continue indefinitely. It had a whole section demonstrating what it claimed was a causal relationship between Krasner's policies and an increase in homicides that relied mostly on a study by a former Republican district attorney and an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute that was widely panned by professors and criminologists and sociologists across the board as having issues with methodology, basic factual errors, and being clearly politically motivated. So the person, one of the leaders of the committee who introduced the articles of impeachment yesterday quoted this article in his comments. That's what they're basing this off of. And they're, it's really interesting because the tactic here is trying to draw on people's fears where there is a certain logic that you could potentially make, arguing that if somebody is going to focus more on certain crimes, on not prosecuting, nonviolent offenses, and then you see a spike in crime, people are likely to, agree with that argument just based on sort of pure logic and some of the fear that comes along with some of the narratives that we've been seeing around, the homicide spike in 2020 and in 2021. But when you actually look at the facts and people are talking about using peer-reviewed evidence and research on this, there's no evidence that there's a causal relationship between these policies and crimes. And the flip side of that is that counties that have tough on crime district attorneys have seen similar spikes, if not larger spikes, in homicides over the same time period with no sort of, similar focus on their offices. There's actually a district attorney in Pennsylvania right now, in Somerset County, who was just barred because he was charged with assaulting his wife, beating her in the head on a FaceTime. And there's been no, such similar efforts to look into his office. He will hold that office until the election, even though there's nobody technically, occupying that office in Pennsylvania. So, that just sort of underscores, that the real motives here.
I mean, no impeachment for that, even though that's a clear crime with video evidence. But what's crazy too is that, and I guess not crazy if you understand Republicans, is that they have undercut Larry Krasner's authority to go after gun crimes, and a lot of some of the increases that they describe, at least Krasner characterizes it as a result of just gun crime, which he did want to go after. He just wasn't trying to criminalize poverty in the city of Philadelphia. So the talk about that starting in 2019, if you could, their efforts to strip his office of the authority to do its job on that front. Basically, and I think this is one of the more under-discussed stories in the country. We saw it with the Chesa Boudin recall too. Local police and other officials who are actively trying to sabotage efforts by progressive district attorneys and then turn around and blame them for crime.
Yeah. So, shortly after Krasner took office in 2018, the House quietly adopted this bill that would give concurrent jurisdiction to the state attorney general for certain gun crimes in Philadelphia. This would be this made Philadelphia the only county in the state where this would be the case. And it effectively, gave the state attorney general, Josh Shapiro, who's currently running for governor of Pennsylvania, the power to take over some of these gun crimes from Krasner. The messaging behind this was that, he wasn't doing his job. Somebody else needed to step in and do it for him. So that passed. It was signed into law by the Democratic governor at the time. It didn't get a lot of attention until a few months later. Protesters in Philadelphia, including one organizer who was later elected to the state house and has been, critical of Krasner, but one of his supporters, they approached AG Shapiro at Netroots Nation and interrupted, a panel that he was on and asked him about this bill, and got him on the spot to say that he would support its repeal. That was a major development in this bill. It ended up, being. It expired. He didn't use it when it was in effect. But it set up, what has been sort of a butting of heads between the AG and the DA's office. They do have to cooperate with each other on a lot of things. And to their credit, I think they both have been sort of working against this perception that they're trying to undermine one another. But at the end of the day, they have been pit against one another. So this also came up when Krasner argued that the death penalty should be unconstitutional in front of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. This was another arena where Shapiro came out and opposed him and said that would have been an overreach of the bench. Fast forward, Shapiro, we reported that later, I think this was in 2019, Shapiro's office had, staffers from Shapiro's office had been emailing with reporters or emailing about stories by the Philadelphia Inquirer and referencing conversations with reporters about, being more critical of his office's approach to prosecuting gun crimes, saying that they weren't answering the right questions. And despite, a statistic in an Inquirer story that noted that his gun prosecutions had been slightly up over predecessors, but what kinds of prosecutions, that they weren't asking the right questions. So seeing, opposition from him from the AG's office there, they obviously denied, having any sort of role in that. But fast forward to today, middle of the election, Shapiro has been, kind of leaning into the GOP attacks on crime, running as somebody who, has the support of law enforcement, will, fight for safe communities, which is all, important in a state like Pennsylvania. But at the end of the day, he has stayed away, notably from the fight in the state that will determine the future of criminal justice reform and prosecutorial policy in a lot of ways. Similarly, the Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman's campaign has been asked about this. They have, said that they agree with Krasner on certain things and disagree on others, and they feel like, the police need to feel more supported. So this is an issue that, national Democrats in the state have been national Democrats and then at the state level have been sort of dancing around, and they feel like it's a toxic issue, so they're not leaning in or trying to sway what's going to happen, which in a campaign cycle is not necessarily surprising.
Yeah, but at the same time, it is a frustrating dynamic that Democrats don't seem to really have a narrative around crime to combat what Republicans are putting out there, other than kicking the left and distancing themselves from the left. And so Krasner's a bit on an island at this point, despite his election to being the Philly DA being so historic, given some of his more progressive stances on criminal justice reform.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem in a lot of states right now, obviously, and something that I think about a lot. We talk about a lot at the Intercept. Like it's easier to lean in and try to out tough on crime the GOP than to make an analytical or intellectual argument that those policies don't work. And I think Democrats have made the calculation that that's too difficult to do, too difficult to communicate to voters without appreciating the costs, the long-term costs, which is not only returning to failed policies and increasing harm, especially for poor Black and brown people, but also turning off voters who came out for these policies in elections outside of Philadelphia, in Chicago, in St. Louis, in LA, where criminal justice reform actually energized parts of the base that Democrats, had lost, going back to 2016. I think they've made the calculation that that's less important than winning over some of the more moderate voters who might be, more susceptible to some of these talking points on crime.
Well, Akela Lacy, politics reporter at The Intercept. You can read her work over at The Intercept about topics like this, among many other things. But Akela's been following this story about Krasner for a few years at this point. So check out her work over there. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Emma.
Of course.